name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We are so pleased to have you with us today. Today's webinar is One Flower, One Garden, One World, From Blossom to Art. Folks have asked for it, and here it is. One image from start to finish, from flower pot to light box to post-production. Fasten your seatbelts because it's going to be a fun ride.
Bumpy.
Bumpy. No, not bumpy. In this unique and detailed presentation, Harold Davis will take you along his garden path to show you some of his favorite flowers for translucent photography and high spring bloom. From the garden, the next stop is on to the light box, where Harold will discuss and demonstrate some of the archetypes of floral composition. The webinar will continue with a demonstration of actual exposure of a high-key sequence on a light box and conclude with post-production in the Photoshop darkroom. Many of you know who Harold is, but if you're joining us for the first time today, here's a bit about Harold. Harold Davis is an artist, photographer, and author. His most recent books include Creative Black and White, 2nd edition, and Creative Garden Photography, both published by Rocky Nook. Harold is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency and an innovator of digital multi-raw processing and hand HDR processing. Harold is an internationally known photographer. His prints are widely collected, and he is a sought-after workshop leader. He is a Moab Master and a Zeiss Ambassador. Harold's website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now, I am going to stop my share and hand it over to Harold.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Phyllis. Thanks for coming here. And, you know, I'm very, very excited to be here. Welcome to spring. This is going to be a complicated webinar. I've said it once, I've said it twice, so bear with us, and we hope it all goes surprisingly smoothly with no hiccups. So that said, I'm going to share my screen. One flower, one garden, one world. I was trying, as I conceptualized this, I've been asked many times by now, please show the whole thing from beginning to end. You know, I love flower photography. If I never did anything else, that wouldn't be bad. And since in this last year, we've had a lot of time to think about developing the garden a bit. It's been a very creatively positive time for me. But that said, we're also one world, and I somehow wanted to bring that into this presentation. And you'll see a bit more of that as we go along here. So here's the cover of Creative Garden Photography. And with the one world theme, this is about making great photos of flowers, gardens, landscapes, and the beautiful world around us. I really think it's fair to say that everything and everybody is connected. You can't have one without the other. And here's the cover of Creative Black and White. And an older book, Photographing Flowers, Exploring Macro Worlds. You know, when you point that camera down onto a macro subject and you don't see anything else but the macro subject, it is truly a unique world to explore with differential world. I put this photograph of one of my posters done circa 1980 into here. This was a very, very, very popular printed piece in its time, and these days is sought after as a collectible. The Dance of Spring is the dance of life. For those of you who really don't know about my earlier career or how long I've been doing this, so I'm going to start with this. And here's a single tulip, a fancy tulip with gestural arms going like this. A honeysuckle blossom on the light box. So we're starting with single flowers here. camellia. This is not a lightbox photo. It is a hand low-key HDR photo. So one of the things I like to say about lightbox photography is if you master the techniques involved, it's really usable across all kinds of photography, not just lightbox photography. Here's a single tulip photographed at Monet's garden in Giverny. And it's low depth of field. So in other words, a selective focus. So just the tulips in focus, and behind it, the tulips behind have this wonderful bokeh. Okay, so from one blossom to two blossom, two daffodils for spring photographed on the light box, and three peonies. I have some wonderful peonies that I'm going to be photographing in the next few days. I loved peonies. Really among my favorite flowers. We do not have them in the garden, and that's one flower that doesn't do too well here in our coastal California climate. So here we have a bunch of first irises, and here tulips, and these are a nice red poppies. You'll see some of those. And back to the one flower theme. This is a Proteus flower here. This clematis and the previous flower are L channel inversions of a lightbox photo, and as is this cutaway of a tulip. And flowers, of course, are beautiful in all parts of their life cycle as they grow older, and the textures turn beautiful. So the concept is called wabi-sabi, a Japanese term. So here's a wabi-sabi tulip on the light box. I guess I got to come back to peonies on above a sea of iris here. And this gazania here is photographed, as I said, as a different country, because here there you could look at it and could say these are vast canyons, but of course this is on a very macro level here. Oh my gosh, I see in the chat box that Maria is surrounded by peonies as we speak. I'm jealous. It's not fair. So another close-up country, some statement here. One thing that does grow wonderfully here are magnolias, like this close-up of a Magnolia stellata with selective focus on the internal part of the flower. And a cutaway here of a tulip. It's perfect otherwise, other than the one petal that's out, so you can really see the inside of the flower integrated with the outside. This is a texturized image, but it's essentially photographic and generated using a long telephoto lens, about 500 millimeters, with focus on the flowers in the foreground to make the sun larger behind it and to make it pop. And an extreme macro of a daisy with the flower down below. So this is in orbit. It's actually using a spider web. For a while I called this my spider web studio, where you get a refraction of the flower in the water drop. This is a complete life cycle of the poppy, of a papaver, with the shell that it popped out of down there, and then the mature flowers up above, a little bit of moisture on it. This one was right down our garden path, I'll be showing you in a bit. And a lightbox image of another poppy. Cherry blossom, called this one Cherry Blossom Special. Here's a low depth of field image of a poppy, where the point is really the color fields going down the side, and the single more intense and in focus core of the poppy. This is a image that I won't comment on too much further, of a beautiful poppy, an Icelandic poppy, in the rain in our backyard, actually. And early morning dew on a dandelion flower. This is the blossom of a plant called the Isopogon formosus, and put on the light box. What's really interesting here are the delicate ends of the there that you can see they almost are hieroglyphs. A focus stacked image of an iris. And this is a Papava roeas, otherwise known as a corn poppy. It's the falling in love variety, of which we'll see more in real life in a little bit. An extreme close-up of the pollen, and the backlighting of the light box really makes it almost look like a candle coming up. So this is an image. I tried to integrate into this presentation as many images from the last month or so as I could. Here's one of them. This is an extreme close-up of one of the poppies from the garden, photographed on black velvet. And another black velvet image here. Please define extreme close-up, question from Judy Rawson. Must I define it? You know, typically a macro image is anything closer than a half life size, so 2 to 1. By the time you get 1 to 1, that's pretty extreme. And if you're twice life size, that's really extreme. You know, this flower is maybe 3-4 inches across. Now this one's really extreme. I mean, but we'll get a few more in the sequence. This is the inside of a kind of mallow, and I used a probe lens to put it inside the blossom here. So you're seeing really at a teensy level, as is the center of this poppy here as well. I've been doing a lot of these lately. This is the inside of a foxglove, a digitalis, and it's sort of like, you can see it's a honey trap. Once you go in there, insects will know exactly where to go. So if you know what a digitalis looks like, a foxglove looks like, and I'll show you one out in the garden, the flowers have a kind of tube shape, which this is inside that tube using the probe lens that I described. The probe has a wide angle macro at the end, as well as a ring LED light, so I can get inside something like a small flower. And I've been enjoying, one of the things I've been doing over the past few weeks is using it to photograph some of the things from our garden. When you look at the centers of these poppies, they begin to look almost like sea creatures. And mostly I don't focus stack with these. Some of them, there's a little bit of focus stacking. I do stop. The probe lens goes from a wide open of f14 to a stop down of f45. And all the ones done with the probe are shot at f45. And even then, in some cases, I've had to focus stack, because the closer you get, the shallower your level of focus becomes. What I find, and this is the topic I think for a whole other webinar on focus stacking probably, if that would interest you, put a comment in please, and we'll keep it in mind as we schedule things. What I found is that the automatic focus stacking programs on this kind of work don't work so well. So really what I have to do is manually use layers and masking to combine different focus areas, and usually that's just 2 or 3 different ones, but they're sized differently, so I have to bring the sizes into a line. So as I said, there's really a whole subject for a whole webinar. And here's even closer with it. Look, it looks like an upside down cake, but it's really the core of a poppy. And here's look at all that pollen, the gift of the flower. Yum. And backing off slightly, this one is kind of about the rolling down the slope of the flower with the core. Okay, moving on to a new topic. I always thought, you know, naive art school student, I always thought chiaroscuro meant kind of the difference between light and dark areas of a photo. Actually, as conceived and defined by Leonardo da Vinci, uh, chiaroscuro is the use of contrast of light and shadow to achieve the illusion of three-dimensional volume in a two-dimensional drawing or painting, and you might say in a two-dimensional photograph. The reason that it looks like the branch in this Magnolia stellata is coming through a translucent flower is because of the contrast between the light and dark, and that can be amplified through digital painting, and was in this case. Here's a black and white of one of the poppies in the garden. Here's another example of, in this photograph that I call Kiss from a Rose, of using the contrast between the light and dark to amplify the apparent depth of the subject. So the most important part of any cut flower photography is arrangement. You can, you know, it's to some level, anybody can learn how to do the photography and perhaps the processing, but the arrangement is where the individuality and specialness comes in. Correct handling of flowers refines the personality and refines the art. Lightbox images have a structure. If they don't have a structure, you can't get them right. One structure, as in this image, is to use the stalks of the flower, an iris, upright, almost as if they were a bouquet. You can see that here also. The irises make the structure of this sunflowers and friends. And here, this is a bunch of these pop-overs like this. So another kind of structure is basically just a mass of flowers, like this iPhone capture of a lightbox image. I guess also another point of putting iPhone images in here is to say you don't actually need a really fancy camera to do this kind of work. And here the campanulas added to the poppies help make the structure, or in the case of this cherry branch, it could be upright like this. With this image, I tried to give the sense of motion in the structure with the seeds coming out to the side. And this one is sort of to say, okay, your arrangement doesn't have to be translucent. With a backlit situation, you can have something like this thistle, which is completely untransparent. Then another possible structure, like these sunflowers, shows the a garden with separate stalks, as does this image, which I call Salutation to the Sun, which you can see these Matiella poppies, more about those in a bit. And that's Rhamnea coulteri, and also, of course, calla lilies coming up with some peonies behind. The Rhamneas are the only poppy that are native to our range, to California, going up from Mexico to California. And here's a massed poppies, a civilization of tulips, I mean. And here's another kind of mass with the with these hydrangea petals in between purple flowers. I call this one Into the Vortex of the Universe, a fairly widely reproduced image of mine. And so there's this crisscross going on in this apparently chaotic situation. So here, I'm not going to go through a complete review of exposing a lightbox flower arrangement. That's something that you'll find in our YouTube webinar recordings in much more detail, and also from time to time, both for camera clubs and perhaps in this context, we'll do a exposing flowers for transparency webinar, which will go through the details of exposure. But here's the short version for review purposes only. The goal in part is to create a white background. If you just let your camera photograph on automatic mode flowers on a light box, the exposure would come out gray, because that's what automatic exposure does. It looks to create a 19% gray overall from something on a white background. You could also achieve the same results using separate lighting for a white background and a foreground, but this is an alternate technique to that has some other advantages. So generally I use 7 to 10 exposures, and I go from completely overexposed to what the camera says is the right automatic exposure, at which point the images are going to start to look gray. I use manual exposure. I bracket shutter speeds in 1 EV increments. I don't go further than what the camera says is the mid-range exposure. And sometimes I process it using automated HDR in addition to layering it. And so the following slides are examples of one of the advantages of having your images on white like this, and that is with a very simple 3 or 4 Photoshop adjustment moves, you can turn the L channel in LAB color of these images from white to black and black to white. So you get 2 for the price of 1. If you have a photograph like this with the proteus in the center and the petals around it, you can turn it black. And here's, just for the heck of it, a combination of an X-ray and a light box image of these ranunculi and roses and a sunflower. Oh yeah, okay, so I thought I would put in a good luck dragon here made of flower petals. Obviously photographed on a light box, inverted using the L channel to a black background, which is more dramatic. Here's the 5-cent version of post-production, and you'll see an actual example of that toward the end of this webinar. Start with the most overexposed image. Use the same conversion settings on each. Add darker images with layer masks and the brush tool, and consider using an automated HDR blend on top of it to add some punch to it. And here are a couple of examples through this. This is an Easter lily bouquet with some dahlias. This was a pandemic garden photo just as we were getting started, like toward the end of April about a year ago. Peonies on parade. And these are definitely flowers from the pandemic garden. I have a huge dahlia bed down in our lower garden, and last year we really got rolling with dahlias. This year I think it's going to be the poppies that are the most spectacular. So, but here are a couple of duets of poppies with very striking characteristics. Again, a pandemic garden image. And this one combines popovers, poppies, and mallows. Did you know that back when marshmallows actually came from mallows? This is one of this year's crop. And this also. Here's a Brugmansia, angel trumpet. And a recent image with that wonderful, spectacular, frilly pink poppy. And I think this is definitely a heart for Phyllis here. Yeah. So the structure here is to imitate a whole garden. And you know, a garden can be kind of disciplined, like these simple poppies and iris, or it can be more complicated, like this tulip panorama here. You'll be seeing this tulip panorama image in a in a widespread context, but I can't really say more about that at this point, right, Phyllis? And a nice single. This is a Papaver corn poppy dawn chorus by the variety. A single iris. This recent one photographed with that probe lens up close for the wide angle effect of a Papaver falling in love. And here's a close up of another Rhamnea poppy. No reason you have to be restricted to a light box. A nice velvet background's fun too. Bouquets are great. This one's like a week ago. I just processed this yesterday, so this one's hot off the press here with these poppies and the very translucent Mattia on top, and even closer here. As you can see, I have a lot of fun with these. I almost put this one up as a background, but Phyllis said it was just too startling. When they sort of look like eyes in this one, for example, or this one, it's sort of like they're having a conversation with me or with you or with everybody. In this one, my design idea was to use the sticks that I cut off a vine in our garden and to make a kind of garden gate out of it as a way to integrate everything together. And this is from a while back. I called this one Paul Clay and Wabi Sabi's Garden. So I thought at the end of this presentation, I should put, since it's one flower, one garden, one world, here are some world gardens. This is in the Parc de Sceaux outside of Paris. This is in Monet's garden in Giverny. This is the Villa Saint Michel in Anacapri, and Isuin Garden in Nara, Japan. And this is our world. Before I move down, here's a discount code for the garden book on the Rocky Nook site only, Garden 40. A discount code for the black and white book, H Davis 40 on the Rocky Nook site, and contacting me. So anyhow, yes, let's get down to the meat. And yes, all images are exposure stacked almost without exception. An exception would be that single tulip in Giverny I showed. That was just one shot, but everything that's on a light box or on black has been exposure stacked. And without further ado, then you can keep on asking questions. I'm going to stop my share here and come down and start the next phase of this. All right, see you in a little bit. So can we see the garden here? Some nice little red poppies. Here's a nice frilly boy or girl, or the case may be, or maybe both in one. So this right now is our poppy alley. And this is remember I showed the inside of a foxglove of digitalis? Well, here's the very thing. So what I did was I put that probe down the inside of that. I'm planning to use this one you see right here in the composition I'm going to make. And you can see it's a kind of blustery day here, not what you associate with the Bay Area this time of year, but such is life. So here I am, and I'm going to, in a minute, hand the driver's seat over to my son, Matthew, and I'm going to get a scissors and something to put it in. And we'll probably, if I come in here, oh, he's coming out. That's great. Okay, thank you, Matthew. Let's cut ourselves some subjects here.
All right. That's a beautiful puffy poppy, Harold.
It is truly a beautiful puffy poppy. Here we have some. Here we have a couple of Rowias falling in lows. To put these in the we're getting there. We just need one or two more, and then we've got a nice. Oh, look at these guys. Along with that, got so mesmerized by these flowers. Might as well take this one too because he's been bowed by the wind, basically. Then just one more, and we're there, I think. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Yeah, no problem.
What I think is that when we go back inside, we probably, I'm going to take these leaves with me because they might be useful. We should probably, so we don't get that reverb, put this guy on mute, I think. Okay, so we have here a light box with a book on it. I also have a tray of flowers I cut the other day that we may use in this, and we also have these ones we just cropped. So I am going to put this camera down for now, I think. Right, and normally in real life, I would be running this right now with the light box on, but if I did that, you people wouldn't be able to see anything because it would be so bright. So we'll wait to turn the light box on until we're ready to do the photography. So right now I'm going to make this wonderful, beautiful, 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 you see it there? The centerpiece. And as a start, what I'm going to do is actually cut the flower off the stem. So how's that, Phyllis, for laying out where the composition should be? Does that work?
Oh, that's perfect.
Okay, because we have to do this in keeping with where the cameras are. Note that sometimes to avoid getting sap on the light box, I will put a small piece of paper beneath the flower before I lay it down. So can you see what I'm doing here?
If you hold it up just a little bit, there you go.
So I am very gently stroking the petals of this to try to get him to relax a little so that he will be splayed out on the light box like about that. Okay, can we see that? Is that reasonable?
I can see it.
Perfect. And okay, let us, boy, I can certainly smell the pollen. The three key tools, I have a very sharp pair of scissors. I have a Felker cropper, which you use for thicker things, Felco #7, Swiss made, and a pair of tweezers is very important for the things that are small and hard to manipulate but with one's fingers. And so in this case, this one has a lot of sap I am going to put down this here so that, and then I'm gonna cut off a little piece of paper towel to put under it so it doesn't get the sap all over the light box. I'll soak it up with the paper towel like this. Generally, my theory of what we're going to do here in terms of the composition is we're going to come out from the bottom and we're going to wrap all our beautiful poppies around in a kind of stem-like kind of way. So it's important to try and figure out the directions of things, also to hold on to pieces like the stem, because you might want to use them for something like this. And I'm going to go like that. And there we go. And I'm just progressing down. You don't always have to have a stem for every flower you have in your composition, but you want enough so it has some verisimilitude to reality, so people can believe in the whole thing. So I'm mindful of that, and you try to make them come to a specific point as well. I mean, hopefully someone down the road could look at this and say, this is a botanical painting from an actual garden. The less you have to do in Photoshop, the better. Photoshop's great, I love Photoshop, but I'd be far more likely to work in and happier working in photography than I am in Photoshop. And apart from anything else, it takes less time. So with this one, I'm just going to put it like that. And I'm going to fill in some of the space on this composition here. And like that. Oh, this one is so pretty. He's such a pretty that. Let's see if so this is really going to be a pretty and pink composition. The predominant color here is really pink. I'm just going to add one more, and then I'm going to add a leaf. Why not? To balance things, basically. And let's see, which of these leaves is best looking? There's something wonderful about all the veins in a nice poppy leaf. It's really a tremendous thing. Oops. You want it a little higher up so that you're not dealing with the very bottom of the composition when you try to put it all together. So I'm putting this back in kind of where I found it, actually. All right. So, gentlemen, ladies, let's get the light box on the floor, okay?
All right, I'll come right up and I'll help pull the coffee table, okay? Just a minute.
Is that good?
It's good for me. I have here camera on a studio tripod. The lens is the 55mm Zeiss Otis Prime. You don't need that lens. Any decent prime lens is a good lens to use for this. My light meter tells me that the right exposure at f16 and here, I'm gonna hold on a second. I'm gonna pull up a chair so you can. At f16 and ISO 64 is a 20th of a second. So I'm going to fire off a shot at a 20th of a second. Done. And now I'm going to move it to 1 EV brighter via shutter speed to a 10th of a second. 10th of a second. Now I'm going to move it another 1 EV brighter or approximate of that to a 1/5 of a second. 1 EV brighter, a 1/2.5 of a second. Don't know why they don't do this in decimal, but they don't. And 1/1.3 of a second. And 1.6 of a second, 1.6 seconds, 3 seconds, and one more exposure at 6 seconds. When I look at the LCD, once it finishes exposing, it's going to look essentially totally white on the back of the LCD, which is how you want it. You can see faint colors in place of where the images are. I should also note that I have long exposure noise reduction turned on. I saw a question go by, am I using exposure compensation? No, I am not. This is manual exposure, and I'm manually setting the shutter speed. I'm leaving the aperture and the ISO constant. In my creative garden photography book, starting on page 85, there's a decent explanation of the relationship of the 3 pillars of exposure, and and how they work. You could consider using exposure compensation for this, but there are a couple of problems. Exposure compensation goes both above and below the right exposure, and it also doesn't go far enough for this. So that's the biggest problem. You can't get enough exposure range using exposure compensation for this, because you really want to go until the image is almost white. Phyllis, before I head upstairs, I can't see a chat box here, but before I head upstairs, are there any questions?
Yes, Donald has one more. He says it also looked like you were setting manual focus one time at the beginning of the sequence.
Yes, that's absolutely right. You certainly don't want the camera refocusing during the sequence. So if you do use auto exposure to focus, I don't have anything really against that. But you then want to just leave it where it's focused. You want to take the autofocus engine off at that point. There's no real reason with this kind of work not to manually focus. And in fact, it's worth noting that the Zeiss lenses are manual focus lenses. They don't autofocus even if you wanted to.
And Don's wondering about what about doing the auto HDR sequence?
That happens in post-production. It's not in the camera. I will be showing that. I'm going to turn my camera off.
Okay.
I'm going to turn the light box off. And I am going to take the memory card out of the camera. So here it is. Here's the all precious memory card.
There you go. Now you're in the middle. All right. And you're going to head back upstairs.
I'm going to head back up. Do I ever use delphiniums in my compositions? Yes, I've been using delphiniums a great deal as a blue to counteract the orange and red in the poppies. But I think our delphiniums are coming to an end of their useful life, alas. But hopefully we'll have other things coming up. We've got a lot of flowers coming up of various sorts. Blue hue after light box. That one is from Linda. uh, that's a slightly tricky issue. You're not doing anything wrong necessarily, but you can fix it in post-production by manipulating the white balance slider, okay? And that you can change the blue off there. And another thing to do is to manually enter the color temperature of your light box into your camera. Let me focus on what I'm doing, or I'm gonna totally lose track. So here's our memory card. I'm taking it and I'm putting it into the memory card slot on this on my MacBook Pro, which happens to be old enough to actually have one, so I don't need a separate dongle. And now I am going to share my screen. So I have here my memory card shown up on in the Finder window on here. You've got the same thing if you're using Windows like this. And here are the images that I just shot: 97, 98, 99, 100 through 104. I'm going to go select all. I'm going to copy them, copy 8 items, and I'm going to open another Finder window, new Finder window. I'm going to put them on my mini rocket drive under one flower, one garden, one world. I'm going to start a new folder for them called raw, like that. And I'm going to paste the 8 items in. So there we go. Now, just so that there's no confusion about anything, I'm going to disconnect the memory card, pull it out. First you eject it via software, then you pull it out. So now I have these images on my local hard drive here, and I'm going to run up Adobe Bridge and go here, and we'll look and see what they are, okay? So here we are at the first exposure, 1/20th of a second. You can see that life is indeed pretty gray. Here is 1/10 of a second. Here is 1/5 of a second. Here is 0.4 of a second. It's done in decimal here. Here is 0.8 of a second. Here's 1.6 of a second. Here's 3 seconds. And here's 6 seconds, my almost white exposure, which is the last one that I did. Are there any questions about these exposures at this point? Okay, well, if you think of anything as we go along, don't hesitate, please. So what I'm going to next do is open these all in Photoshop. I actually probably don't want the darker ones, but I'm going to open them anyhow. It's easy enough. So to open them all at once, I can go select all, and I hold down the Alt key. I open copies, and here they are. They're all opening up in Photoshop. Just by the way, with the default settings, I haven't changed anything in there. I just open them all up as they are. What I'm next going to do, once all these are open, is I'm going to record an action to create reduced versions of all of them, because I don't want us to have to sit through the agony of actually working over Zoom on this computer on high resolution files. So you'll see how to do that as I do it. It's a fringe benefit of the whole thing. You can see as they're opening up that it's successively light ones that are opening. You could open as layers in Photoshop. That would work just fine. The only thing about that, Donald, is that the question from Donald was, could you open as layers in Photoshop instead? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that since I don't always use all the layers and I don't always use them in the order recorded, I actually prefer to do it manually so that I have more individual control. I mean, there's nothing to stop you once you have a layer stack from moving the order of the layer around or anything else. But my preference is actually to open them manually instead. You could also take them through Lightroom instead of through Bridge. So, you know, one of the things about workflows in Photoshop or in Lightroom, for that matter, or in any program, is that there are always alternate ways to do everything. But yes, you could simply open them as a layer. Just to avoid confusion, I'm shutting down Bridge. So now we have all these big, huge, humongoid raw files converted using default conversion. Nothing fancy there in Photoshop. So I'm now going to open my Actions panel. Now we have the Actions panel. I'm afraid it's probably kind of small on here. And the first thing I need to do to create a nice action to do this is I need to take it off the button mode. All right. So I scroll down to the bottom of this thing, and I am going to create a new set. And I think it moved the set thing over to my other screen. So hold on a second. I'm going to grab it. And I can call this demo for a webinar. And now I'm going to create a new action. And I'm going to call this action, I'm going to call it reduce. And I start recording it. So the first thing I do to record it is I go to image mode and I change it from 16 bits to 8 bits. That helps take down file size. Then I go to image size, and I put the resolution down from 300 to 100, like that. Next, I do a save as, and I'm going to save it as when it gets there in a new subfolder called reduced. Create, save, and finally I'm going to close it, and then I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, so all I have to do for each of the subsequent images is play that action. So, and it takes care of reducing it and moving it over to the folder called reduce. So this is a short course in Photoshop Actions, perhaps not what we actually expected. But the reason for this is that we simply don't want to watch this thing go through its peregrinations otherwise. I'm putting it back to button mode. You can see that reduce is now here on the button thing. And for future reference, if you wrote an action, if you recorded an action like that, but then wanted to do the same thing in another folder, all you would have to do is go back to out of button mode and go to the actual code here and double click on where it says save and change the folder, and automatically it would change the action to that. Just to double check, you could see that you have all these smaller files here in the reduced directory, and I'm going to go back to Bridge and have a look at them here. So these are just the same things that we had before, but in manageable file size. What I'm now going to do is take a subset of these images and run them through an HDR program. just because that is sometimes a suggested thing to do, not that it always produces good results. So I'm going to take the exposure at 3 seconds, and I'm going to take it down to the one at 1/5 of a second. So these 5, and I'm going to send it to HDR FX Pro. And then these basically, in these dialogues, you just basically click OK, and then you get there. You don't need to worry about alignment or ghost reduction because we were aligned and there are no ghosts in these images. So you just hit create HDR. You can see this is bad enough even at these reduced size. Can you imagine what it would be like if I were trying to do this full court with full file sizes? So if you look at this, you can see that the complaint that it's both too dark and also too blue is very valid. So I can fix the too blue by moving the white balance slider, the color temperature slider, to the right to about here, up about 25%. And I can fix the exposure by dealing with the exposure slider, and that's beginning to come into something like an image one might like. I should exercise the usual cautions that you hear with these things, that it's good to do this on a profile monitor and so on, which I'm not doing in the least bit now. And in fact, all of you out there in Zoom world are seeing something different than what I'm seeing probably. But we can only do our best with that stuff. So here is a HDR version, and it's really not bad. We can do better manually, but it's not bad. So I'm going to save this off and minimize it. So save as, I'm going to start a new folder under raw called work in progress reduced. It's no point me being too fussy about all this because it's not something, since it's reduced anyhow, that I could ever use in real life. And this is really just a demo to make the process clear here. I'm going to call it HDR. Note that I'm saving it as a Photoshop file, not a TIFF, which was what they wanted me to, was what they offered me as default. So there you go, it's saved. Now let's go back to Bridge and look at our reductions. So the first file that I'm going to open is the 6-second one at 104. And let me make it a bit smaller. You don't want to crop it in until you've got your layer stacked together. Just for clarity, I'm going to call it 6 seconds, and it's number 104. So naming your layers is a great way to help keep things straight. Next, I'm going to pull up my 3-second one. And so I'm going to move my 3-second one in alignment on top of the other one. So I hold down the Shift key, pull it over, let go of the mouse key, and let go of the Shift key. So this is 3 seconds, and it's number 103. So let me close 103 here. We don't want it. We can close this to make things a little clearer too. I'm going to put a hide all layer mask hide all on top of here. And now I'm going to take my brush, and I'm going to, I'm using on the keyboard the bracket keys to make my brush bigger and smaller. I'm going to put my opacity at 100%, my flow at 100%, and I am going to paint in the layer we just added on the top. Like this. And this and this and this. We have a leaf down here. I'm going to make my brush a heck of a lot smaller for the stems. Like that. And you can look at the layer mask I just painted and see what I did. Pretty much the whole thing in the center is white like that. Again, as I mentioned, you don't crop the image until you're through with your layer stack, because otherwise alignment becomes an issue. Also, if you have something around the periphery of your image, if I had my tripod leg right over here, for example, or the edge of the light box, you can paint it out on the bottom layer using white, no problem at all. So that's a very interesting point. So next we're going to go up to 102, which is 1.6 seconds. This time I'm going to, don't know why that thing just went black. Let me just put it down here. I believe that I am going to have to close and open Photoshop, I'm afraid. Let's see, let's save this one as, so that we have it here. We're going to call it pass, like that. And I'm going to have to open and shut Photoshop because my memory just started making everything black, which isn't a good look.
Not very helpful to have everything black, is it, Harold?
No, though sometimes even on my production machine, the memory can't quite keep up. The video memory can't really keep up with everything I do when I do complex maps, and that's enough to. I tend to be reluctant to buy new hardware, but very honestly, that's enough to get me there almost, because it's really frustrating to try to do this stuff without being able to. Okay, so here's where we were before. We had the 6 seconds on bottom. We add the 3 second to that, and now I'm going to go and fetch my 1.6 seconds again. It's frustrating when your video doesn't keep up with you. It really is, but it happens. I mean, that's one of the things that one has to sort of reconcile oneself to as one does this. This is not a particularly easy process, even for people who are experienced with it and with Photoshop. And you just have to keep going. So I'm going to copy this over by a different way this time. I'm going to go select all, edit, copy, and then I'm going to go over here, edit, paste. And this layer should be at the top of the stack, not in the middle. And so this was 1.6 seconds, and it's number 102. Okay, so let me shut it down.
And yes, Deborah asks, do you do this on a desktop? Yes, you do it on a desktop all the time.
Right.
But
no, much more powerful computer than this one.
Absolutely. But for Zoom, we use this laptop.
Alas, haven't figured out any real way. Actually, so my production machine has a 30-inch monitor, which you really want for this. And I haven't figured out any way to show that sharing the video screen where it looks reasonable. It does bizarre things to, when you try to put a really high resolution monitor in over Zoom, it just doesn't look good. So there you have it. So here I am painting this in, and this is at 100%. And actually, I think this is, let me open up my history. That was kind of too much. Okay, so I'm gonna I'm gonna back it down to 50% and make it 50% flow. And I'm also going to make my brush bigger. No reason to do this with a small brush. There, that's better. It's worth keeping in mind that later on in the process, you can always make things darker or lighter. I mean, there's no huge difficulty with doing those things. So I'm not that worried about overpainting. I mean, my main concern is kind of with the HDR process, getting all the detail in place. Okay, so here's what that layer mask looks like. So I'm beginning to be a little more selective about what I paint in. Let me make the brush smaller again and do a little more of the stems. Okay, let me go grab the next one. And this is 101, and what was it? It was 0.8 of a second. So we're getting into something like normalistic exposures. Okay, so 0.8 of a sec, and number 101, like that. I'm going to shut down the file like that. I'm going to put a hide all layer mask on, layer mask hide all, and I'm going to start painting in edges here. So one of the things that I sometimes make a mistake with is I don't get all the edges because you can't see what you don't got underneath. So it's important to explore so that you make sure that you get all the edges. At the same time, you want to be a little delicate about this too. And my full recommendation is to put on headsets with some good music, whether that be Bach or Pink Floyd or Leonard Cohen or whatever it is. Because this is really a process that takes quite a bit of patience. Okay. You really want to get to a point where you're happy with it before you add the HDR, which we did reserve. Okay, so here's the 0.4 of a second one. I'm going to pull it up, and you can see the background here is definitely on the blue-gray side. So you want to be careful about how you put it in, because if you just slurp it over, you're going to get some of the gray blurs, which are not a good thing. So one thing I'm going to do once I label it is I'm going to make my brush harder. And the reason I make my brush harder is I don't want things to leak out of it. It was at 11%. I'm now changing it to close to 30%. And I'm going to put a hide all layer mask on, layer mask, hide all. And this would be done much more selectively, like about like that. Okay, like that. This leaf could use a little more for sure. Okay, well, I'm going to open up my history panel and back off that a little, because while the leaf can use some more, not quite that opaque, I'm moving the opacity on this down to 33% from about 50%, 49%, like that. There's a nice leaf. You can begin to see the capillaries and veins in the leaf. I'm going to put my opacity back up to 50%-ish and paint in the edges of this Papaveroes here, like that. Sure, we get the edges of that one. And like that. That was too much, so I'm back down on that. Yeah, the this frilly one, I forget what kind it is really pretty much opaque, so it needs a different kind of handling than the others. Get the edges here, and okay, let's back down to about 30% here. Let's make our brush a bit bigger, like so. And I think that's good enough for now. Not a bad idea to remember to save pretty regularly. Let me open up the reserved HDR. Open
And
recent.
Harold, Judy's wondering, how do you avoid the gray blur as you paint so casually?
Well, you know, it's not as casual as it looks, as I guess the only answer. How long have I been doing this, Phyllis?
A few years now.
Yeah, a couple of years. I mean, it's like the consultant who walks into some place and charges $12,000 an hour, and they say, a bill for $12,000, you only spend an hour here. And he said, yeah, but I spent 50 years learning how to do it. I mean, I'm sorry if I make it look too casual. It's not necessarily easy. The skills involved in painting good layer masks are more akin to the skills involved in painting probably than they are in photography. You know, once you understand the controls, it becomes a little easier. The business that I said of upping the hardness of the brush is really important, because that lets you control how much slips over the edge. A really soft brush can be beautiful, but it's going to produce gray blurs. There are also a whole set of techniques. I mean, and I would recommend to you some of the video recordings. For example, you can use a curve adjustment in LAB color to enhance the lack of gray blurs by making the whole thing whiter. You can also paint over things with white. So there are remediation techniques. I mean, the real bottom line here is it takes a fair amount of practice to get it right. So how do you get to Carnegie Hall, Phyllis? Practice, practice, practice. And B, there's like a whole tool quiver of tools, of which what I'm showing with this so-called casual painting is really only the first one. All right, let me move on here.
Oh, and Lynn had a question. I missed how Harold handled the blue-hued background on the last image, and I answered, Harold put the layer on top of the layer stack, then added a black hide-all layer mask. This hides the blue-hued background, and then he paints in what he wants on the layer mask.
Which is a great answer. I mean, what you're seeing in this aggregate here is the white background from the brightest light layer. I'm going to go through that again in a minute, but let me get this HDR on top first. So you can see that if I just painted this in, I would sure as heck get the gray blurs, the gray blurs. I'm going to put layer mask hide all onto here. I'm going to check my brush size, not bad, and I am just going to paint in a little bit. I would be very careful if I were painting at the edges of anything, but typically you want, here I'm going to make the brush a little smaller here. That's another issue is you want to right size your brushes always, whatever that is, and you want to come in close enough so you can really see what you're doing, which I'm not doing a terribly good job of at the moment, but in real life I really do. I look at what I'm doing close up, because how can you control something you really can't see? I did mention also the 30-inch monitor. You really don't want to be doing this on a laptop. So here I'm going to save this layer stack, and let's have a review here.
And Maria's wondering if your brush hardness is still about 30%.
That's a good question. I think the answer is yes. It is, though. I mean, partly there. In real life, I would paint in the HDR a little more carefully, and I would want to be very careful. Phyllis, you have somebody else connecting to audio here, from what I can see. You'd want to be very, you see what I mean?
Yep, Jane finally made it. Hooray. Let's change Jane to an attendee. Bye, Jane. There you go. Sorry, Harold.
That's okay. You want to be very careful about how you paint in with something like the HDR because of the gray blurs. I'm going to first have a look at that's all I painted in of the HDR. It's just for little bits. Okay, see those dots on the screen? It's not the most important part of this. I also want to make really, really, really clear that this is a webinar. We've been going for closing in on 2 hours at this point, which is something like my emotional and mental limit. And I cannot cover every bit of the process in depth. We have an immensity of resources available, including the Creative Garden Photography book, which has a substantial section on this, and really courses and webinars on every single part of it. So there are a lot of resources out if you want to dig deeper into it. And, since a lot of us are mostly taking our masks off if we're vaccinated, I will say that in-person workshop is really the way to go with this, because that way I or the assistants I have can take a look at what you're doing if you're up the wrong tree and help you, because there's okay, you get the point. This is a set of techniques that cut across all aspects of photography. If you master this, when you master this, you will be able to do many things with it that don't just involve flowers on a light box. I commend it to you. Anyhow, here was the 6-second exposure, unbound and unmasked. Here's the 3-second exposure on top of it with a mask, beginning to look like something. The 1.6-second exposure, beginning to look like something more. The 0.8-second exposure, we're almost there. The 0.4-second exposure, that one got the outlines of the Papaverroias. It didn't do much more. And here's the HDR on top. Very little change, just the centers really. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to, technical term, smush down the layers. That's the flatten the image. And I'm going to save it as, and I tend to number my versions A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I think the highest I ever got was after Z, B, B or something. There can be a lot of versions of these, but you want to archive a version before you layer it down. Really, really, really important. Next, I'm going to crop this image. I put the crop tool on width plus height plus resolution, so I can crop it to any shape I want. Typically, you don't want stems floating in midair, so cropping it below the lowest stem is good. There are some botanical compositions that do crop in midair, and that can be okay too. So where is my checkbox? There it is. So I am now cropped. It's almost square. In real life, I might actually make this a square because there are some advantages to square compositions. I'm going to show one thing more, which is using the common blending modes to improve this. And then I'm probably going to call it a wrap and take questions. So let's go ahead and do that. Layer, duplicate layer. Let me put the first duplicate into screen blending mode, screen. And to do that, you take this drop-down list and you choose screen. The blending modes, as many of you probably know, are divided into categories on this drop-down list. So some dark and some light and some increase contrast and some do weird things with color. Those are basically the 4 groupings. So you can see that screen lightens. It's most akin in photographic process to dodging. Screen blending mode is like dodging. So I'm going to put a layer mask over, hide all, and now I'm going to very selectively, I'm going to turn my hardness back down to below 10%, and I'm going to put my opacity at 40%, my flow at 50%. I'm going to give myself a bit bigger brush, and I am going to lighten up this wonderful frilly one. I'm going to do a bit of lightening here, a bit of lightening here, a bit of lightening at the edges of the leaf, a bit of lightening here, and a bit of lightening here. What you really want to do is, if you move in one direction, you want to move in another direction as well. So once I've moved in screen blending mode, I also want to move to darken, which is like burning. And what you do is you use the multiply blending mode for that. So I'm going to call this layer multiply. I'm going to put the blending mode to multiply, which darkens. And I'm going to put a layer mask over it, layer mask, hide all, and I'm going to paint this guy in a bit more up here. I'm going to, my brush incidentally is still at about 40% opacity and 50% flow. I'm particularly somewhat concerned about the edges of the Falling in Loves because they need a little special handling for this stuff. I'm going to take my opacity down to about 17% and paint in a bit more of the leaf. When I said back at the first layer stack situation that you can adjust later on pretty easily for darkening and brightening, what I principally meant was using these layer modes this way. I'm going to duplicate my background one more time. Duplicate layer. I'm going to move to the top. I'm going to put it to screen blending mode. No, I already did screen. I'm sorry. I'm going to put it to soft light to increase contrast. Everyone see how that increased the contrast? Layer mask and hide all. And I'm going to up my brush to about 40%. And that just makes things pop a bit, which is part of the whole point of this. You want it all popping. This is increasing contrast here. And by increasing contrast, you also increase apparent sharpness. I have to show one other thing. I can't leave without showing one other thing. Okay, let us go back to the first layer stack. Here it is. Let's suppose that we'd had a tripod leg on it. I'm going to draw in a tripod leg here, sort of. Okay. So this is how it came out of the can, okay? And you have that on all the subsequent layers too. That's not very nice, but it doesn't matter as long as it's away from your subject, because what you can do is you can sample your background color like that, because the background is actually not entirely white. Take a brush tool, put it at 100% opacity, 100% flow, and paint out your tripod legs or whatever else there is there, or your rug, or the edge of the light box, or whatever else there is. Okay, I don't really want to save that, but so I'm not going to save it. I'm also going to stop my share before I lose my voice entirely and throw it open to questions. Have we got any questions?
There is a question about the archiving and flattening. And
important.
so I said, Harold uses flatten because all the layers flatten down to one layer instead of leaving hidden layers behind. And also Harold's makes sure is to save the file with all the layers using a different file name before flattening.
Absolutely.
That's what he calls archiving.
And let me quick show the LAB conversion. Let's see. So let me share my screen again. And I am going to pull up. I'm going to pull up the last thing we did. Okay, so this image here has 4 channels. We've saved it as A. I'm going to flatten my image. I'm going to save it as B. And like that. Now, I should say there's a whole category of LAB webinars on our webinar recording page. I think we have 5 or 6 of them by now. This is a big topic. It's not any, do not, once again, don't expect to master it right now. I also have a course that I did for LinkedIn Learning, which is a very detailed course, table of contents, all kind, and like 8 hours of instruction or something ridiculous like that. So there are places to learn about this. So this is just going to be a quick overview. So the first thing I do is I put it into LAB. Note that in LAB, you have 3 channels, lightness A and B, which is a bit different than in RGB or CMYK. So without going into a great deal of detail, these channels are important because they are color opponent. They contain the colors and the opposites. The A goes from green to magenta and magenta to green. B goes from yellow to blue and blue to yellow. And lightness is the grayscale channel going from white to black. What you want to do is you want to highlight the lightness channel, and you want to make sure all channels are visible. And then you go image mode, image adjustment, invert, like that. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And then to lighten it, because the flowers here are obviously a little too dark compared to the rest of these things, you go layer, duplicate layer. I'm still in LAB color, and I can go image adjustment curve, like that, and I can pull my curve over to lighten it like that. And then I can put a hide all layer mask on, layer mask, hide all, and I can take my brush and I'll put the opacity to 70, the flow to 50. I'll make it a bit bigger, and I can paint in the stuff that was too dark, like that. I'm going to put the opacity and flow all the way up for that leaf, which needs a little extra work. Must have a lot of had a lot of white in it. You get the idea. Let me show you one other thing here. Going back to where I just turned it into LAB color, like that. Note that that I'm turning my actions panel into button mode. Note that we have a lab action. And what this lab action does is it presents all kinds of LAB possibilities, a palette of possibilities. This is available for free download from our website. And so you can see these various manipulated color possibilities are generated by this macro. I'm not going to go into great detail about how it works, but it's obviously useful because you can use bits and pieces of these. Here's the L version, which we did manually, in almost anything you want to do. There's the 10-cent version of LAB color. Yeah, Deborah. Well, I got to tell you, yes, this is dense material, no kidding. And, I'm not going to apologize for it being dense. It is what it is. But please also, if there are specific areas that interest you and that you want, go to some of the other resource sections, in the other webinar recordings. And thank you, everybody, very much.
Hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.